The Marx family soon moved from the Chelsea flat. When they had been there scarcely more than 6 months, trouble with their landlady and a lack of ready cash caused their summary eviction. Jenny related what happened shortly afterwards in a letter to Wademeyer. I shall describe to you just one day of that life, exactly as it was, and you will see that few emigrants, perhaps, have gone through anything like it. As wet nurses here are too expensive, I decided to feed my child myself in spite of continual terrible pains in the breast and back. But the poor little angel drank in so much worry and hushed up anxiety that he was always poorly and suffered horribly day and night. Since he came into the world he has not slept a single night, 2 or 3 hours at the most, and that rarely. Recently he has had violent convulsions, too, and has always been between life and death. In his pain he sucked so hard that my breast was chafed and the skin cracked and the blood often poured into his trembling little mouth. I was sitting with him like that one day when our landlady came in. We had paid her 250 thalers during the winter and had an agreement to give the money in the future not to her but to her own landlord, who had a bailiff's warrant against her. She denied the agreement and demanded £5 that we still owed her. As we did not have the money at the time, Knott's letter did not arrive until later. 2 bailiffs came and sequestrated all my few possessions: linen, beds, clothes, everything, even my poor child's cradle and the best toys of my daughters, who stood there weeping bitterly. They threatened to take everything away in 2 hours. I would then have to lie on the bare floor with my freezing children and my bad breast. Our friend Schramm hurried to town to get help for us. He got into a cab, but the horses bolted and he jumped out and was brought bleeding back to the house, where I was wailing with my poor shivering children. We had to leave the house the next day. It was cold, rainy, and dull. My husband looked for accommodation for us. When he mentioned the 4 children, nobody would take us in. Finally a friend helped us. We paid our rent and I hastily sold all my beds to pay the chemist, the baker, the butcher and the milkman who, alarmed at the sight of the sequestration, suddenly besieged me with their bills. The beds which we had sold were taken out and put on a cart. What was happening? It was well after sunset. We were contravening English law. The landlord rushed up to us with 2 constables, maintaining that there might be some of his belongings among the things, and that we wanted to make away abroad. In less than 5 minutes there were 200 or 300 persons loitering around our door, the whole Chelsea mob. The beds were brought in again. They could not be delivered to the buyer until after sunrise next day. When we had sold all our possessions, we were in a position to pay what we owed to the last farthing. I went with my little darlings to the 2 small rooms we are now occupying in the German Hotel, 1 Leicester Street, Leicester Square. There for £5 per week we were given a humane reception. On expulsion from their house in Chelsea in April 1850 they found a permanent lodging in 2 rooms in 64 Dean Street, a house belonging to a Jewish lace dealer where Heinrich Bauer, treasurer of the Refugee Committee, also lived. Jenny described the summer there with the 4 children as miserable. Prospects in London were so bleak that Marx considered emigrating to the United States together with Engels. He prepared the ground for a continuation of his publishing projects there and went as far as to find out the price of the ticket, but this was hellishly expensive and instead the Marx family merely moved up the street to number 28, while Engels departed to work in his father's firm in Manchester. The move was prompted by the death of Guido, born just a year previously, who died suddenly from convulsions caused by meningitis, the first of the 3 children to die in Dean Street. In spite of these difficulties, Marx was very active politically. His first few months in London were taken up by 3 interrelated activities: his work on behalf of refugees in the framework of the German Workers' Educational Association, the reorganization of the Communist League, and his efforts to start a monthly journal on the pattern of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. He regarded all 3 as means of rebuilding the Marx Party as it had existed in Cologne in 1848. The day after Jenny's arrival in London, a committee for the assistance of German political refugees was elected by a General Assembly of the Association, to which it was to present monthly accounts. Marx was one of the chosen members along with Blind, Bauer, Fander and Fuster. The committee immediately began to collect money through personal contacts and newspaper appeals, both mainly in Germany. After only 2 months, however, the committee had to be reconstituted. For with the departure of Blind and Fooster and the arrival of Willich in London, the orientation of the committee became too extreme for radical Republicans such as Struve and Heinzen, who tried to form, separate from the association, a new and politically more moderate committee. Although these efforts, which were renewed in the following April, failed, they did lead to the reconstitution of the original committee, with Engels and Willich elected to the 2 vacant seats, and a change of name to the Social Democratic Committee for the Assistance of German Refugees. This disagreement was part of a wider split among the refugees, for the Orthodox Republicans, led by Struve and Heinzen, formed a workers' league in opposition to the association. The new committee, of which Marx became president and Engels secretary, was very active during the following year. It raised over £300 and helped more than 500 refugees, though the original generous donations decreased as numbers grew. A hostel was set up in the summer of 1850 to house 18 refugees and feed about 40. The plan was to make the hostel self-supporting by turning it into a multi-purpose factory staffed by refugees. But these ideas never materialized. he now began to devote great energy to the League's work. It is not entirely clear how Marx became a member of the Central Committee. Official election is unlikely. Probably he was co-opted by Bauer and Icarius, as later were Engels and Willich. At any rate, he attended its fortnightly meetings and eventually became its president. The League had been far from inactive during 1849, although the Central Committee's June address stated that the failure of the Revolutionary Party in the previous summer for a time practically dissolved the League's organization. The Central Committee was condemned to complete inactivity until the end of the previous year. This was an exaggeration, and Marx stated later that on his arrival in London, I found the operation of the Communist League there reconstituted and the links with the rebuilt groups in Germany renewed. But the general confusion and dispersion in late 1849 certainly diminished the League's activities. Ideologically, too, the secret propaganda society, as Marx described it, was far from homogeneous. Although it is true that not every applicant was admitted to membership and that there were sometimes even expulsions, there was no clear orthodoxy, nor would this have been possible so long as contact was simply by letter and by the occasional emissary bearing an address from the Central Committee. In what Marx now as later called his party, he certainly did insist on ideological purity, but this party was by no means coterminous with the League, nor was it composed exclusively of League members. It was made up of the comparatively few people who to varying extents knew Marx personally, understood his views and respected their overriding superiority. In January 1850, Marx attempted to reorganize the League in Germany and sent a letter to the cigarmaker Roser, the future chairman of the Cologne Group, who later turned King's evidence, urging him, in Roser's words, to found a group in Cologne and do my best to found similar ones in other Rhenish cities, since he too considered it necessary, now that freedom of speech and of the press had in fact been suppressed, to reorganize the League, since future propaganda could only be carried on in secret. Roser responded by asking for official statutes that would preclude any conspiratorial tendencies. Marx replied that these would be ratified by a future Congress, but that for the moment they should adopt the general guidelines laid down in the Communist Manifesto. In an attempt to give some sort of unity to the League in Germany, the Central Committee sent Bauer on an inspection tour in March with a mandate signed by Marx and an instruction on tactics composed by Marx and Engels. This famous address demonstrated how far Marx had changed his mind on tactics during the previous year. He now accepted the necessity for organizing both secretly and publicly the Workers' Party alongside, but independent of, the official Democrats, and now approved of the Central Committee's previous attempts to reorganize the League in Germany. Marx attacked all types of Democratic Party whose interests, because they represented the numerous German lower middle class, were bound in the long run to be opposed to those of the proletariat. Marx's advice here was this: while the democratic petty bourgeois wish to bring the revolution to a conclusion as quickly as possible, and with the achievement, at most, of the above demands, it is our interest and our task to make the revolution permanent, until all more or less possessing classes have been forced out of their position of dominance, until the proletariat has conquered state power, and the association of proletarians, not only in one country but in all the dominant countries of the world, has advanced so far that competition among the proletarians of these countries has ceased, and that at least the decisive productive forces are concentrated in the hands of the proletarians. Thus the workers should initially support any bourgeois democratic revolution while retaining their independent and, if possible, armed organization. If this revolution were successful, the workers should keep up the pressure by demanding nationalization of land and a united and highly centralized republic. The slogan that Marx proposed at the end of the address, "Revolution in Permanence," did not imply that he believed in an imminent proletarian revolution in Germany, though he did think it likely in France and was much more sanguine now than later about the probability of an economic crisis. At the end of the address, Marx talked of a lengthy revolutionary development and gave this final advice to the German workers. They themselves must do the utmost for their final victory by clarifying their minds as to what their class interests are, by taking up their position as an independent party as soon as possible, and by not allowing themselves to be seduced for a single moment by the hypocritical phrases of the democratic petty bourgeois into refraining from the independent organization of the party of the proletariat. The address was accepted and copied out by the Cologne Group as they found no conspiratorial tendencies in it, and Bauer proceeded to visit groups in all parts of Germany in a similar fashion. On his return, he passed through Cologne, where some criticism was expressed about the initiative taken by London, on the grounds that Marx had dissolved the League in 1848 and there had as yet been no official reconstitution. However, this was not the majority view of the Cologne group, and Bauer's mission was in general deemed by the Central Committee to have been successful. The precise influence of the Communist League in Germany is difficult to assess. The membership seems to have been composed mainly of middle-class intellectuals who often had a rather idealized picture of the proletariat and whose only means of attaining practical influence was contact with workers' associations on the model of the London Group. These associations, a response to direct social needs, held open elections, exerted strict control over elected representatives, and concentrated on practical activities such as mutual aid and formal education. Although in some towns, Cologne and Frankfurt, for example, the influence of League members on the associations was considerable, the grandiose claims made in the June address of the London Central Committee should not be taken at their face value, although the second address still stated that the early outbreak of a new revolution could not be far away. Its tone and purpose was different from that of the March address. It asserted the supreme authority of the London Central Committee when confronted with the claims to a separate autonomy made, for example, by a German refugee organization in Switzerland, as well as by other groups, all of which were active in Germany itself. The address gave a rather optimistic account of the state of the League in Belgium, Germany, France, and England, and also postponed the General Congress which had been requested by Cologne. Its bombastic style, lack of realism, and excessive optimism concerning contacts with workers' organizations and the army make it doubtful that Marx and Engels played a large part in drawing it up, though they must have acquiesced in its final form, as they never disavowed it, and it was even reprinted by Engels. The address did not entirely achieve its purpose, for there were still disagreements between London and the Cologne group. The latter had always viewed itself as no more than a propaganda society and angrily accused Marx of unbrotherly conduct when he charged them with lack of energetic activity. A General Congress was to be held in London in September, but the split in the Central Committee in September 1850 prevented it taking place. The address also announced to the German groups the Central Committee's contacts with French and English revolutionary parties. At the end of 1849, Marx had attended a dinner organized by the left wing of the disintegrating Chartist movement, known as the Fraternal Democrats, whose leader, George Harney, Marx knew from his previous stay in London. At this dinner, Marx made the acquaintance of exiled leaders of Blanquy's party, and in April 1850 the Universal Society of Communist Revolutionaries was formed. The signatories were Marx, Engels, and Willich for the Germans, Harney for the English, and Vidal and Adam for the French. The first of the 6 statutes, couched in the spirit of the March Address, read: "The aim of the society is the overthrow of all the privileged classes, and to submit these classes to the dictatorship of the proletariat by maintaining the revolution in permanence until the realization of communism, which will be the last organizational form of the human family." The statutes were written in French and drawn up by Willich. The Universal Society also began to issue revolutionary propaganda. Barthélemy, one of the most flamboyant of Blanquy's disciples, reported to his leader, "We have begun, together with the German communists, to draw up a revolutionary manual containing a numbered list of all the measures that the people will have to take immediately after the revolution." The society did not survive the split in the Communist League when most of the Blanquists sided with Willich. It did, however, achieve a temporary unification of the European left after 1848, and as such was a forerunner of the First International. A key factor in all Marx's political activities in 1849 and 1850 was his effort to establish a newspaper that would continue the role played by the Neue Rheinische Zeitung in the 1848–49 revolutions. Before he left Paris, he already had specific plans for a journal which would act as a rallying point for his scattered party. Its title of Neue Rheinische Zeitung Politisch-Ökonomisch Review indicated, firstly, the continuity with the previous paper, secondly, the intention to transform it into a daily as soon as circumstances allow its return to Germany, and, finally, the close link that Marx saw between socio-economic investigation and political activity. The last months of 1849 were taken up in the search for contributors and a publisher. In December, Theodor Hagen, a member of the Communist League, informed Marx that the Hamburg publisher Schuberth was willing to take on the review. Schuberth took 50% of all the income to defray the cost of publication, while the rest of the arrangements, including that of distribution, through agents who took a commission, were left to Marx, who bore the cost of them. Shares were advertised in the hope of raising £500, and Konrad Schramm was to go to the United States with the support of the Chartists and Blanquists to raise money there, but neither scheme was realized. There were also delays in publication. The intended date was January 1st, but Schuberth received no manuscript at all during the whole of January, partly owing to Marx's illness at the end of the month. The manuscript did arrive in early February, but with the printer's lack of paper and his difficulty in deciphering Marx's frightful handwriting, publication was further delayed. In addition, Schuberth was also worried by the possibility of prosecution and thought that Marx, as editor, should tone down the articles, for he can handle language like no one else on earth. The issue intended for January, with a printing of 2,500, eventually appeared early in March, and the 3 ensuing numbers followed fairly quickly until mid-May. However, relations with Schuberth swiftly deteriorated. He was slow in sending information about the sale of the journal, he altered the text without consultation, and did not distribute it according to instructions. The revenue from sales was very small, and in May Jenny Marx wrote to Weidmeyer saying bitterly that it was impossible to tell which was the worst, the delays of the publisher or those of the managers and friends in Cologne, or the whole general attitude of the Democrats. The charges against Schuberth were certainly justified, but the tone of the review was too intellectual to have any wide impact. One of the leading members of the Cologne group, Roland Daniels, wrote to Marx, "Only the more intelligent from this party and the few middle-class people who have some knowledge of history will be interested in the revolution by the publication of your monthly." During the summer the review was in abeyance, and the final number, a double issue, appeared in November. Marx considered Schuberth to have been so negligent that he, unsuccessfully, took steps to prosecute him. He also had plans to continue the review as a quarterly in Cologne, or, alternatively, to publish it in Switzerland. These plans came to nothing. It is difficult to see how the review, or indeed the Communist League to which it was intended to give an intellectual orientation, could have been successful in the circumstances. Both depended on the enthusiasm generated by the revolutions of 1848 to 49 and the expectation of the imminence of a similar wave of unrest. These hopes were common to all the refugees, including Marx, who, before he left Paris, had told Lassalle that he expected a fresh revolutionary outbreak there early in the following year. In fact, Marx's contributions to the review, whose declared aim was to provide a complete and scientific treatment of the economic relationships that form the basis of the whole political movement, document his progressive realization that the economic prerequisites for his political aims were just not there. In the original publicity for the review, Marx had stated that a time of apparent truce like the present must be used to shed light on the period of revolution that we have lived through. This was the intention of one of Marx's main contributions to the review, a series of articles entitled 1848 to 1849. These articles were republished later by Engels under the title The Class Struggles in France, and described, with justification, as Marx's first attempt to explain a section of contemporary history by means of his materialistic conception. The Class Struggles in France was a brilliant and swift-moving account of the changing political scene in France during 1848 to 49 against a background of class and economic interest. Marx's general judgment on the failure of the recent revolutionary upsurge was given to the opening words, with the exception of only a few chapters. Every more important part of the annals of the revolution from 1848 to 1849 carries the heading, Defeat of the Revolution. What succumbed in these defeats was not the revolution. It was the pre-revolutionary traditional appendages, results of social relationships which had not yet come to the point of sharp class antagonisms, persons, illusions, conceptions, projects from which the Revolutionary Party before the February Revolution was not free, from which it could be freed not by the victory of February, but only by a series of defeats. In a word, the revolution made progress, forged ahead, not by its immediate tragicomic achievements, but, on the contrary, by the creation of a powerful, united counter-revolution, by the creation of an opponent in combat with whom, only, the party of overthrow ripened into a really revolutionary party. Marx continued with an analysis of the July monarchy, likening it to a joint stock company with the state continually kept on the verge of bankruptcy so that the bankers and brokers could speculate on its debts to the ruin of the small investor. The resulting general discontent erupted into revolution with the severe effect on French industry of the 1845-46 commercial and industrial crisis in England. But the provisional governments set up after the February barricades could do no more than mirror the disagreements of the various classes that had created it. It was to some extent a criticism of his own past actions in Germany when Marx declared that it was an illusion for the workers to have hoped for emancipation alongside the bourgeois or inside the national walls of France. The inevitable result of the May elections, he continued, was a bourgeois republic against which the workers could but revolt in vain. But their very defeat The incredible growth of the railway system showed that New York and San Francisco were usurping the place in world trade hitherto held by London and Liverpool. Marx continued, the fulcrum of world commerce, in the Middle Ages Italy, more recently England, is now the southern half of the North American continent. Thanks to the gold of California and to the tireless energy of the Yankees, both coasts of the Pacific will soon be as thickly populated, as industrialized, and as open to trade as the coast from Boston to New Orleans is now. The Pacific Ocean will then play the same role the Atlantic Ocean is playing now and the role that the Mediterranean played in the days of classical antiquity, and in the Middle Ages the role of the great water highway of world commerce, and the Atlantic Ocean will sink to the level of a great lake such as the Mediterranean is today, the only hope for Europe of avoiding industrial, commercial and political dependence on the United States was a revolution which would transform the mode of production and intercourse in accordance with the needs of production arising from the nature of modern productive forces, thus making possible the development of new forces of production which would maintain the superiority of European industry and counteract the disadvantages of geographical situation. Marx finished the article with a remark on the recent beginning of Chinese socialism and the social upheaval brought about by contact with the West, an upheaval that must have the most important results for civilization. The second article on current affairs comment, written in April, dealt more specifically with the possibilities of revolution in Europe. Marx thought he saw an approaching crisis in Britain due to overinvestment, particularly in the key wool industry. The interaction of this crisis with the imminent upheavals on the continent would give to the latter a pronounced socialist character. In Britain, the crisis would drive from power both Whigs and Tories to be replaced by the industrial bourgeoisie, who would have to open parliament to representatives of the proletariat, thus dragging England into the European Revolution. A note added later just as the review was going to press admitted that there had been a slight betterment in the economic situation in the early 1850s, but declared, nevertheless, that the coincidence of commercial crisis and revolution is becoming ever more unavoidable. As the months went by, however, this short-term optimism was more and more difficult to sustain. It was to be entirely dispelled by the systematic study of the economic history of the previous 10 years that Marx undertook in the summer of 1850. In June of that year, Marx obtained the ticket to the reading room of the British Museum that he was to use so often in the years ahead. His reading there in July, August and September consisted mainly in back numbers of the London Economist. The main conclusion, as Engels put it later, was that the industrial prosperity, which has been returning gradually since the middle of 1848 and attained full bloom in 1849 and 1850, was the revitalizing force of the newly strengthened European reaction. The results of this study were set down in detail in the long current affairs comment written in October for the last number of the review. Marx declared bluntly, the political agitation of the last 6 months is essentially different from that which immediately preceded it. The real basis for this change was the period of prosperity that had begun in Britain in 1848. The crisis of 1845–46 had been due to overproduction and the accompanying overspeculation in railways, corn, potatoes, and cotton. With the economic stabilization of 1848, additional capital tended to be invested, and speculation was less easy. The most striking evidence of this temporary prosperity was the plans for the Pantheon in the modern Rome, the Great Exhibition of 1851. This prosperity was paralleled in the United States, which had profited from the European depression and the expanding market in California. Newly prosperous Britain and America had in turn influenced France and Germany, both of which were dependent on the economic situation in Britain, the demiurge of the bourgeois universe. The conclusion of this detailed discussion was with this general prosperity, in which the productive forces of bourgeois society develop as luxuriantly as is at all possible within bourgeois relationships, there can be no talk of a real revolution. Such a revolution is only possible in the periods when both these factors, the modern productive forces and the bourgeois productive forms, come into collision with each other. The various quarrels in which the representatives of the individual factions of the Continental Party of Order now indulge and mutually compromise themselves, far from providing the occasion for new revolutions are, on the contrary, possible only because the basis of the relationships is momentarily so secure and, what the reaction does not know, so bourgeois. From it all attempts of the reaction to hold up bourgeois development will rebound just as certainly as all moral indignation and all enthusiastic proclamations of the Democrats. A new revolution is possible only in consequence of a new crisis. It is, however, just as certain as this crisis. At the end of 1851, Louis Napoleon seized power in France as emperor, thus consolidating the reaction that had followed the 1848 revolution. Marx immediately composed a series of articles which were published by his friend Wedemeyer in a short-lived New York journal under the title The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. They constitute his most brilliant political pamphlet. The title is an allusion to the date of the first Napoleon's coup d'état in 1799, and Marx was concerned to examine the socio-political background of Louis Napoleon's repeat performance in December 1851. In a preface to a second edition of his essay, Marx contrasted his own approach to that of two other well-known pamphleteers on the same subject, Victor Hugo and Proudhon. Hugo confined himself to bitter and witty invective, whereas Proudhon, seeking to represent the coup d'état as the result of antecedent historical development, ended up with a historical apologia for its hero. I, on the contrary, wrote Marx, demonstrate how the class struggle in France created circumstances and relationships that made it possible for a grotesque mediocrity to play a hero's part. Marx began his demonstration by referring to the remark of Hegel that all facts and personages of great importance in world history occurred twice, and added that the first time was tragedy and the second, farce. So it was with the two Bonapartes. He continued, men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the minds of the living. And just when they seem engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things, in creating something that has never yet existed, precisely in such periods of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service and borrow from them names, battle cries, and costumes in order to present the new scene of world history in this time-honored disguise and this borrowed language. Marx applied these considerations to the 1848 revolution and drew a distinction between 18th-century bourgeois revolutions, whose very speed and brilliance made them short-lived, and 19th-century proletarian revolutions, which possessed a slow thoroughness born of constant interruption and self-criticism. Turning to the recent coup d'état, Marx found unacceptable the excuse that the nation was taken unawares. A nation and a woman are not forgiven the unguarded hour in which the first adventurer that came along could violate them. The riddle is not solved by such turns of speech, but merely formulated differently. It remains to be explained how a nation of 36 millions can be surprised and delivered unresisting into captivity by three swindlers. Marx then summarized the period dealt with in his class struggles. The success of Bonaparte was due to his having organized the lumpen proletariat of Paris under the cover of a benevolent society, with himself at their head. However, this immediate force had to be set against the long-term factors in Bonaparte's favor. The first of these was the old finance aristocracy, who celebrated every victory of the president over its ostensible representatives as a victory of order. And the reason for this was evident. If in every epoch the stability of the state power signified Moses and the prophets to the entire money market and to the priests of this money market, why not all the more so today, when every deluge threatens to sweep away the old states, and the old state debts with them? The industrial bourgeoisie, too, saw in Louis Napoleon the man who could put an end to recent disorders. For this class, the struggle to maintain its public interests, its own class interests, its political power, only troubled and upset it, as it was a disturbance of private business. When trade was good, the commercial bourgeoisie raged against political squabbles for fear that trade might be upset. When trade was bad, they blamed it on the instability of the political situation. In 1851, France had indeed passed through a minor trade crisis, and this, coupled with constant political ferment, had led the commercial bourgeoisie to cry rather an end to terror than terror without end, a cry well understood by Bonaparte. Marx devoted the last part of his article to a closer examination of the class basis of Bonaparte's power. To Marx this seemed to be non-existent. The struggle seems to be settled in such a way that all classes, equally impotent and equally remote, fall on their knees before the rifle butt. The explanation was that, having perfected parliamentary power only to withdraw it, the revolution had now to perfect the executive power in order then to destroy it. Marx outlined the history of this bureaucracy, this executive power, with its enormous bureaucratic and military organization, with its ingenious state machinery, embracing wide strata, with a host of officials numbering 500,000, besides an army of another 500,000, this appalling parasitic body, which enmeshes the body of French society like a net and chokes all its pores, sprang up in the days of the absolute monarchy, with the decay of the feudal system, which it helped to hasten. During and after the Revolution of 1789, the bureaucracy had prepared the class rule of the bourgeoisie. Under Louis Philippe and the parliamentary republic, it had still been the instrument of the ruling class. Under the second Bonaparte, the state seems to have made itself completely independent.
Marx then immediately qualified this by saying, "And yet the state power is not suspended in midair."
Bonaparte represents a class, and the most numerous class of French society at that, the smallholding peasants. The identity of interest of these peasants did not create a community, since they were physically so scattered. Thus they could not represent themselves, but had to be represented. But the peasants on whom Napoleon relied were burdened by a mortgage debt whose interest was equal to the annual interest on the entire British national debt. Finally, the army had degenerated from the flower of the peasant youth into the swamp flower of the peasant lumpen proletariat. Thus, according to Marx, the three key ideas of Napoleon I: independent small holdings for peasants, taxes to support strong central administration, and a large army drawn from the peasants had found their ultimate degeneration under Louis Napoleon. However, centralization had been acquired, and that would be an important feature of the future society. The demolition of the state machine will not endanger centralization. Bureaucracy is only the low and brutal form of a centralization that is still afflicted with its opposite, with feudalism. When he is disappointed in the Napoleonic restoration, the French peasant will part with his belief in his small holding, the entire state edifice erected on this small holding will fall to the ground, and the proletarian revolution will obtain that chorus without which its solo song becomes a swan song in all peasant countries. It is interesting to note that this passage,
with its emphasis on centralization as a progressive factor, was omitted in the second edition of the 18th Brumaire.
1869. The conclusion that a new revolution was possible only as a result of a new crisis marked the end of Marx's first period of political activism and his return to the economic studies that had been interrupted by the events of the late 1840s. Inevitably, the implications of Marx's views were quite unacceptable to many members of the Communist League. In London, the chief spokesman for this opposition was Willich. The differences between Marx and Willich were not only doctrinal. Willich came from an old and distinguished family. It was even said, and Willich did nothing to dispel the rumor, that he was descended from the Hohenzollerns. Since the age of 12 he had made his career that of a professional soldier, and he was a good one. Engels, his adjutant in the 1849 uprising in Baden, described him as brave, cold-blooded, skillful and of quick and sound perception in battle, but, when not fighting, something of a boring ideologist. Willich seems to have made an unfortunate impression on the Marx household on his arrival in London by bursting in on them very early in the morning with colorful attire and excessive bonhomie. Jenny even thought that Willich was out to seduce her. "He would come to visit me," she wrote later, "because he wanted to pursue the worm that lives in every marriage and lure it out." At any rate, it was natural that Marx should be jealous of Willich's flamboyant posturing, just as Willich was outraged both by Marx's waning enthusiasm for immediate revolutionary struggle and by his autocratic tendency, according to Willich, to divide mankind into two parties, Marx and the rest. There was also an increasingly unfavorable contrast made by Willich's friends between intellectuals such as Marx, who lived with his family, studied in the British Museum and lectured on economic theory, and practical men like Willich, who lived a bachelor among the refugee workers, shared their hardships and thought that all problems were really so simple. Marx might command the distant respect of the workers, but it was Willich who won their devotion. These differences soon caused dissension in the Central Committee of the Communist League, of which Willich had become a member on the suggestion of Marx himself. In the spring of 1850, Willich quarreled violently with Engels and refused attempts by the Central Committee to mediate between them. In August, Marx opposed Willich's suggestion to the Central Committee that they form a united front with other democratic refugee organizations. The same divergence of opinion occurred in the Committee for Refugees. Here, when Willich found himself in a minority of one, he resigned and took the dispute to a general meeting of the association where he gained the support of the majority. Marx found himself outflanked on the left and called a reactionary for his defense of the tactics advocated in the Communist Manifesto. Thus fortified, Willich returned to the attack in the Central Committee on 1 September, and passions were so roused that Willich challenged Marx to a duel. Marx had moved a long way since his student days in Bonn and disdained the suggestion, but Konrad Schramm, whom Marx described as the Percy Hotspur of his group, challenged Willich in turn, despite Marx's dissuasions. Dueling was outlawed in England, so they took the night boat to Ostend, Willich being accompanied by Barthélemy. Liebknecht has left an account of what followed.